Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Mobile Application Security, Don't Cheat Yourself. My name is Nan Palmero and I will be your moderator today. Throughout our presentation, we encourage you to interact with our speaker by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane. We'll be answering your questions live following the presentation. Also, we're recording today's session and we'll make the recording available soon following the event via email. Now on to today's speaker. A globally recognized application security expert, Dan Cornell holds over 15 years of experience architecting, developing, and securing web-based software systems. As Chief Technology Officer and Principal at Denham Group, he leads the technology team to help Fortune 500 companies and government organizations integrate security throughout the development process. Real quick, we're going to ask you to make sure that all of your phones are on mute before we get started. And now, Dan will present on the topic, Mobile Application Security, Don't Cheat Yourself.
Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everybody, for coming out today to listen to this. What I want to talk about today is some work that we've done looking at mobile security. And mobile security can be a complicated topic. As we'll see, mobile applications tend to have a significantly more complicated threat model than web applications. And so the assessment of these applications can be more complicated. And a challenge we saw in looking at a number of organizations and how they were addressing mobile security testing, in certain cases, they were cheating themselves. They were looking at parts of the system, but not others. They weren't getting sufficient coverage from the testing. And so we're going to look back at the threat model for mobile applications, kind of a generic threat model, and we're going to do some analysis of vulnerability data that we've gotten from some of the assessments that we've performed and look at where are we finding the most vulnerabilities and, more importantly, the most serious vulnerabilities in these mobile application systems. And in addition, what sort of assessment techniques allowed us to find those vulnerabilities? And the goal for everybody to take away is to understand, first of all, a little bit more about a typical mobile application threat model, but also to have some data that they can use so that you all can use when you look at crafting an assessment program for your mobile applications. You see where you maybe want to invest more resources versus less resources, and ultimately you want to come to an understanding of the level of coverage to expect based on the investment that you guys are making. From an agenda standpoint, I'll provide a typical mobile application threat model and talk about how that's distinct or a little bit different than you typically see from web application threat models. I'll talk about the assessment methodology that was used for the set of assessments that we're using for the data, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of the data collected. And then we'll go through the findings. We'll look at the types of vulnerabilities that were identified. What are the vulnerabilities that we find most frequently? What are the serious vulnerabilities that we find most frequently? And we'll look at how that overlaps with the OAuth Mobile Top 10. We'll look at where vulnerabilities were identified. An important point to take away from the discussion today is an understanding that mobile security is not just about code running on the mobile device. These mobile applications are actually systems of applications. You have code that runs on the device. You have code that runs on the device. You have code that runs various web services, corporate web services, and you also potentially have third-party web services that you're using. And finally, we'll talk about how vulnerabilities were identified. What sort of testing techniques? Was it a static analysis technique or was it a dynamic analysis technique? Was it found by an automated tool or was it found via manual inspection? And again, from this, hopefully that'll put you in a situation where you can better characterize when you're looking to talk to management about mobile security, the types of activities that you may want to invest in and the level of coverage, the level of risk insight that you're going to get based on those. So just as an introduction, this data comes from a subset of assessments that we've worked on. There's 61 different mobile application system assessments that are reflected, spread across 20 different applications. What we found, the top line number, 957 vulnerabilities. And if you look at the most vulnerable applications, we had 3 assessments that had 10 critical vulnerabilities. So obviously that's a little scary. And across the board, we had, only 3 assessments had only 1 vulnerability. All the other assessments had more. And so, in all of the systems that we looked at, we found at least some issues that an organization may choose to address. And in certain cases, we found, again, 10 critical vulnerabilities, which is something that could be considered to be pretty serious. From the research background, again, we'll look at this application threat model and talk about the assessment methodology. This is a subset of the mobile security work that we've done because we needed answers about the different parts of the system that were addressed, as well as the types of assessment techniques that were used. We could only use assessments where we had all of those techniques that went into it. And we'll, again, talk a lot about what we find in an automated way versus manual testing. We've used MITRE's CWE, or Common Weakness Enumeration, for our vulnerability type classification. We'll talk a little bit about that, and again, we'll talk a little bit about the data. So a big challenge with mobile applications is the threat models tend to be a lot more interesting than they are for a typical web application. In a web application case, you've got bad guys live outside the firewall, all right, and you control the web server that is in an application server that are executing the application, right? And of course, with HTML5 or JavaScript applications, some of the some more behavior is moving to the browser, but your typical kind of standard canonical web application, you have a pretty good idea of where the bad guys are and where the good guys are. In a mobile application, you're going to have code that runs on this untrusted device, right? And that's where a lot of people focus, and it's an important area to be aware of, right? So you've got code that's running on a device. It might be rooted, it might be jailbroken. That device might be lost by a legitimate user and acquired or stolen by a malicious user. And so you've got a lot more data and behavior of the application that is running in a far different situation than you see with a typical web application, right? And so you don't just need to be aware of the code running on the device, however, because any really interesting mobile application is probably going to talk back to something or some things on the server side. So typically for mobile applications, you've got some enterprise web services that have been deployed to allow for account access, access to other resources, and a lot of mobile applications also call out to third-party web services to get some sort of data. And it's important in looking at the security of these mobile application systems that you're taking into account these different components, how they interact with one another, because that is where we see some, as we'll see, that's where we see some pretty interesting vulnerabilities or weaknesses that are built into these systems. And so a challenge, again, that we've seen in a number of organizations, when they think of mobile security, they think solely of the code running on the device and worrying about, well, are we storing passwords unencrypted on the device? Are we storing sensitive data on the device? Those are obviously very important things to look at, but what we wanted to investigate further as we looked across these different systems that we're investigating, we wanted to get better insight. If you look across take a holistic view of mobile application security, we wanted to know where are we finding the most and the most serious vulnerabilities, what types of vulnerabilities are they, and what testing techniques were the most effective in finding them. Again, mobile application threat model is, they're more complicated, and that means that the types of testing techniques become important. So from an assessment methodology, to include these tests in our population, what we needed to see was both a combination of static testing, so looking at source code or looking at binaries, combined with dynamic testing, looking at the systems as they actually run in production, the mobile application, the web services, and so on. And we used a combination of both automated tools as well as manual review of the automated test results and manual testing. And so what we're looking at with these assessments is a pretty holistic view of these applications, their different components, and using a number of different testing techniques. And what we looked at and said, the scope of these assessments can include code running on the device itself, all right, so your actual mobile application, whether that's native or something else, as well as enterprise services that your organization or that the organization had deployed in support of these mobile applications. In certain cases, also looking at third-party services. And one of the challenges was, in certain cases, we didn't have the ability, the authorization to do dynamic testing of the third-party services, and I think in no cases we actually have access to do static testing of the third-party services. so that may have an impact. That's something to understand when kind of considering the data that we have that came out of this. The severity was determined using the DREAD model. So we looked at a combination of the damage potential. All right, if this vulnerability were to be exploited, how bad would the damage be? We also looked at the reproducibility. How easy is it to reproduce this problem? Exploitability. How easy is it to exploit? How sophisticated does an attacker have to be in order to potentially exploit this? The affected users. What population of users would be affected or may be exposed based on the vulnerability? And the discoverability. How challenging is it to discover this vulnerability? Each of those factors gets ranked 1 to 3. Those get averaged, and that gets collapsed out to a single dimension, with criticals being considered those above 2.6, high being ones between 2.3, 2.6, medium 2.0 and 2.3, and then lows being those below 2. And so the idea here, with the assessment, is to look at the impact of the vulnerabilities, or look at the severity of the vulnerabilities in a multidimensional way, but then be able to roll that up so that we can characterize it along a single dimension. Why do we use CWE? Again, the vulnerability taxonomy that we used was MITRE's common weakness enumeration. What we found in a lot of the work that we've done, every tool has their own naming scheme that they use to describe different vulnerabilities. That's great, except ultimately as an industry, we need to be able to roll this data up into something where we're all talking about apples and apples or oranges and oranges. The OAuth top 10 or the mobile top 10, is helpful, but it's not a list of all the things that could go wrong. It's a list of, here's the 10 things that we consider to be the most severe, the most important. Similar with the Web Application Security Consortium, the list that they have as well. CWE is intended to be exhaustive. They're still filling out certain classes of mobile vulnerabilities, and it can be a little bit sprawling at times, but it's a reasonably well-adopted standard. A lot of tools have mapping back to the CWE for their results, and so ultimately, I kind of view the CWE as it's like democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones that people have tried. CWE, and I say this again with love and respect to the MITRE CWE team, it's the worst vulnerability taxonomy out there except for everyone else's. And so, we've had a lot of success using CWE for this type of research, as well as other research things that we've done. And again, this assessment data, just to characterize it, comes from a subset of assessments that we've done. Because we're looking at the prevalence of vulnerabilities in different classes, there are different parts of the system. We had to be testing all those parts of the system for a particular assessment because we wanted to characterize the data according to how the vulnerabilities were discovered, static versus dynamic, automated versus manual. And if you look at these are mostly customer-facing applications from different organizations in the financial services space. Also, it's predominantly iOS and Android applications. There's a WAP application or two. There's a Windows Phone application or two in there, as well as some BlackBerry applications. But primarily coming from iOS and Android applications. And so we want to look at the types of, first we want to look at the types of vulnerabilities found. And we'll look at this both from a standpoint of the, overall, what are the types of vulnerabilities that we found most frequently? And what I think more importantly is, let's look at the most serious vulnerabilities. So if we look at the vulnerabilities that were ultimately characterized as having high or critical risk levels, those are the vulnerabilities we probably want to focus on. Realistically, from a remediation standpoint, we work with a lot of organizations helping them plan for remediation, helping them to exit remediation. Realistically, it's the criticals and highs that are the ones that you have the greatest chance are going to be something that you care about and that you need to fix. And so we're going to try to look at the data, again, for this and other analysis, both across the board for all the vulnerabilities, but then to focus in on the criticals and highs. And so we see the 10 most prevalent CVEs or CWEs from an overall information leak through log files, information exposure, both considered low risk. And again, we found a number of those, as I think we'll see and talk about later. I think a lot of that is due to the rule sets for the static analysis tools, having certain rules that allow you to find these. But again, if you look at the severity, they tend to be characterized as lower risk. Also looking at clear text transmission of sensitive information. If you think from a threat model standpoint, the mobile application, the mobile device is going to be communicating over a number of untrusted networks, whether those be Wi-Fi or carrier networks, and so we see a lot of situations where information is being communicated and not in a secure manner. We've got SQL injection that shows up in a number of cases, and that's fairly prevalent. Again, the fourth most common vulnerability, but is it critical? And as you see, there's other situations here. Input validation, external control of resources, information leak via debug information, CSRF, other information exposure, and bad crypto practices. And so if you look overall, these are the most common vulnerabilities that we identified as a part of these assessments. But if we focus in, the most prevalent CWEs, so we're only looking at the critical and high risk. Again, we see SQL injection, again, appears on this list as well, but we see other problems. With the information leak, data being stored on the device, being able to bypass server-side controls, access control authorization issues, pretty serious, and as well as bad user management, bad resource exhaustion, XML problems communicating between the client and the server, cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and again, resource exhaustion. And I think a question came through asking about the SQL injection. Was that SQL injection on the server side or on the device? The SQL injection vulnerabilities that we found, especially the ones that were characterized as critical, were found exclusively on the server side. And so those were contained in either the third-party services or the enterprise web services. If you think back to how Dread characterizes the damage associated with a given vulnerability, a SQL injection on the local device is interesting, may reflect a bad practice. It's very hard. Like I've coded, we have an application called Pandemonium that is an intentionally vulnerable application we use for training, and it's very hard to code a client-side SQL injection vulnerability that has a realistic exploit scenario that results in pretty serious data loss. You can certainly make a proof of concept, but if you look at that through the lens of Dread, where you're really looking at how hard is this going to be to exploit, what's the actual damage going to be, the client-side injection issues are interesting from a academic or from a maybe from a capture the flag type of scenario. In the real world, we don't see a lot of that, and that's one of the things we'll talk about here in just a minute when we look at how our data stacked up against the OAuth Mobile Top 10, their list of mobile application risks. Which here we are. So we look at the OAuth Top 10 mobile risks, very similar to the OAuth Top 10 web application risks, but targeted at mobile applications. I suspect that everyone on this webinar was able to suss that out. Again, we've got a link. The slides will be posted, and they're doing some work, and we've been talking to the folks running that project as well. They're looking, much as the OAuth Top 10 has matured over time to move from reflecting here's what experts think to here's what experts think, and here's data that supports these decisions. Similarly, the mobile Top 10 risks folks are working to start to include data sets like ours to help have better justification for what are considered to be the most significant risks. And we're happy to be talking to those folks and excited to see the results. So if you look at the OAuth Top 10 mobile risks, you've got bad data storage, typically on the device. You've got weak server-side controls, so this list does reflect the fact that mobile applications, their vulnerabilities in mobile systems aren't just based on problems with the client device or code running on the client. We look at insufficient transport layer protection, failing to protect data while it's in transit. Client-side injection, again, we just kind of discussed that a little bit, and we'll see when we look at the overlap how that fared. Poor authorization and authentication, and that's an interaction between the code running on the client and the whether or not the server side has an appropriate control in place to force proper authentication, to force authorization before access to different resources. that's tied up also with session handling. How do you, in the web world, cookies are the pretty standard way that a browser maintains its session state with the server side. All the application servers support this. In a mobile world, this gets a little more complicated. You may not be able to use cookies rather than that. Some challenges with when you require people to re-authenticate and for what different types of operations. So session handling is something that becomes more important, or not something you get for free out of the box. Also looking at making security decisions based on untrusted inputs. Side channel data leakage, when you look at things like mobile applications that are taking pictures, are they accidentally encoding the GPS location there? Broken cryptography, again, especially if you look at an untrusted device that may fall into the hands of an attacker, that becomes something you're even more concerned about potentially than looking at server-side data. Not to say that's not important. And sensitive information disclosure, what can be discovered by watching these mobile systems. So what we found with our data was there was a very strong overlap in that the mobile top 10 mobile risks, they talked about weak server-side controls. We saw those. Poor authentication authorization, again, we saw those. Security decisions being made via untrusted input, common, as well as this sensitive information disclosure. So we saw a very strong overlap between this issue, or these issues in the mobile top 10 and the prevalence of the CWE data that we looked at. If we look at the overlap, where there certainly was some overlap, insecure data storage, we saw some instances of that. Bad transport layer protection, we saw that as well. Session handling problems, again, as well as this side channel data leakage and cryptography. The one area where we saw a very weak or no overlap was this client-side injection. And I think, again, that comes back to the challenges associated, well, I look at it from the standpoint of when I try to write an insecure mobile app, it's not that you can't introduce with SQLite databases or other interpreters running on the device, it's not that you can't introduce problems into the system using this, but if you look at the impact is typically not that great. And so if I ask, like, hey, what if I'm typing into the mobile application and I can SQL inject it? Well, if I own the mobile device that's running the mobile application that has the SQLite database on it, I can do whatever I want. I can just root the device or jailbreak the device, pull the SQLite database off, and I can put whatever data in or pull whatever data out that I want. And so that's again, from a science project standpoint, client-side injection is interesting. From a real-world standpoint, we did not find a lot of situations where that was a serious risk for most systems. So let's move on and now look at where did we find these overall vulnerabilities. We found 60% of the vulnerabilities were found in the web service. 342 or 36% on the device, and a very small 2% found on the third-party web service. Some of that I think can be explained, might be explained because of the lower level of rigor applied to these third-party web services. Again, we didn't have the ability in certain cases to fully test those web services. We didn't have the authorization, and again, none of them gave us that source code access. But what we see here is that if you're only looking at the code running on the device, you're going to miss stuff. You're going to miss a lot of stuff. And if we drill into where we're finding critical and high-risk vulnerabilities, so the stuff we really care about, 70% of those vulnerabilities were found in the corporate web services, 25% found on the device, and 5% found on the third-party web service. And so if your assessment or assurance routine, again, is only looking at code on the device, you're missing 3/4 of the critical and high risk, or you run the risk of missing 3/4 of the critical and high risk vulnerabilities. And so that's really what goes back to the theme of don't cheat yourself. If you're standing up a mobile application assessment program, you need to pay attention not just to the code running on the device. You also need to understand how that code is interacting with third-party web services, and in a lot of cases, most importantly, the corporate web services that you are exposing. And I think that a challenge that we see in a lot of cases for organizations, web services, the testing tools, the dynamic testing tools aren't as strong typically as they are for standard web applications. And in a lot of cases, these web services get turned on. They're they're not subjected to a lot of adversarial testing or even a lot of adversarial view. The only clients in a lot of cases that have talked to these web services are the approved mobile clients. And so I think that causes vulnerabilities during development. Nobody's really paying attention. If they're only receiving traffic that has been intended for those web services, you're not going to identify bugs or potential vulnerabilities. And so, again, some analysis of this. Again, mobile security is about more than the code running on the device. Obviously, that's an important part. We're finding 20%, right? 20 or 25%, sorry, of the important critical and high vulnerabilities there. But the critical and high vulnerabilities are most frequently found on these corporate web services. And so if your assessment program is not investigating these corporate web services, that's a pretty big blind spot that you have. If you look from a coverage standpoint, that's a pretty big blind spot, and you run the risk of missing a lot of pretty serious things that are out there. I think it also reflects, like this data reflects, because we ran it through DREAD in order to characterize the critical, high, medium, and low. This, I think, reflects the scale associated, the scale benefits associated with finding these web service vulnerabilities. Right? If an application stores a user's username and password on the device unencrypted, that's obviously bad. Right? But if you look at an exploit scenario, you're going to say, well, this data is on the device. Great. How is someone going to get access to it? Assuming that you don't have a permissions problem like Android or something, you say, okay, well, this means that this person has to either sell the device on eBay, they have to lose the device, they have to have the device stolen. Somehow that device has to fall into the hands of a malicious attacker. And maybe that's a targeted attack where somebody goes and steals a particular device, or maybe it's a kind of a trolling attack where people buy stuff off of eBay to see what they can find. So there's obviously a very significant impact, but you're losing control over one account or one user of the system for every successful exploit. If that doesn't scale like finding a server-side SQL injection vulnerability where someone can all of a sudden start to pull down reams and reams of data from the server side. And so there's a lot of scale associated with finding these vulnerabilities on the server side, and I believe that led to the kind of data that we've seen here, which is having the most serious vulnerabilities identified on the server side. And again, that doesn't mean you should ignore the client side. 25% of the critical and high vulnerabilities were found there, but it does, I think, speak to the need for assessment programs that look at all these different components of the system. So now let's look at how we found vulnerabilities. And again, we used a number of different testing techniques. We used both static analysis, code and binary review, dynamic testing, looking at running looking at a running system, how it behaves to different stimuli. And we also looked at the difference between what we found with automated versus manual testing. How successful is automated testing? Where do you have to do manual testing? And we wanted to know what techniques identified the most vulnerabilities, and again, most specifically, or more importantly, what techniques identified the most serious vulnerabilities. Because our concern there is, if you have a testing budget that is limited, which I strongly suspect applies to 100% of the people in the world, right? You don't have an unlimited testing budget for all of your applications, right? And especially when you start dealing with compliance concerns and things of that nature, you're going to have to make tough decisions about at least parts of your mobile application portfolio, and you're going to have to determine, what different tools or classes of tools and what level of manual effort does it make sense for us to bring to bear so that we can get sufficient coverage. And, again, hopefully this data can put folks in a position where they can start to make some of those tough decisions. So if we look at the static versus dynamic method of finding vulnerabilities, again, a lot of low-risk vulnerabilities identified in by static analysis, but also pretty significant critical vulnerabilities. If we look at dynamic testing, we found, again, a lot of low-risk vulnerabilities. It's a medium risk, but then it tails off pretty quickly if you're looking at the high risk and the critical. And so, looking from a static standpoint, as we'll see, there's a lot of low-risk vulnerabilities that got kicked up and have to be addressed. But if you're not doing static testing of these different parts of the system, you're missing some pretty significant critical stuff. And so that's an interesting data point that came out of this. If we look at the different techniques, what percentage were found, again, we see that the lower risk vulnerabilities, overwhelming identified by these analysis, and that just speaks to the fact that there's more, low level or low impact vulnerabilities than there are high. Now, if we look at the critical and high risk vulnerabilities, the static testing was more effective when finding these serious critical and high risk vulnerabilities, right? But again, it also found these lower risk vulnerabilities. And the thing to understand, and we'll talk about some, we call them like other findings or additional information. That's one of the challenges. So understanding as you implement a code review program for mobile applications and their associated components, kind of the situation is static testing is effective in finding stuff, but you've got to work on the rule sets and the type of testing that you're doing, because each of these low-level findings that was identified, you should probably review those to determine the actual impact. And so you've got to really work to tune the rule sets and how you evaluate the results, and there's a cost associated with doing that. If we look at automated versus manual finding of vulnerabilities, we're looking at automated versus manual finding of vulnerabilities. Again, what we see here is the manual stuff found. We found a lot of stuff, low risk vulnerabilities, medium risk stuff, but also some, an important set of high risk and critical vulnerabilities. The automated testing had, again, this interesting pattern where it kicked up a whole lot of low risk vulnerabilities that you've got to deal with, but also identified these critical vulnerabilities, the ones that you really need to know about when you're looking at the system. I think there's a question asking if the static testing is code review. The static testing, and we'll look more in depth about combining these two variables in just a minute. And so when we're talking about static versus dynamic, static is either manual code review or automated source code analysis or binary analysis. Whereas the dynamic review is fuzzing, web services scanning, and so on and so forth. And we'll see data about that here in just a minute. And so again, if you look at the automated versus manual method of finding vulnerabilities, what we see is that there's a number of important things that were found by the critical and high risk vulnerabilities were found by manual testing. A lot of the medium risk stuff, but also some low impact vulnerabilities. And so if we drill this in just to look at the criticals and highs, again, automated testing was more effective when finding these serious critical and high vulnerabilities. And so that's good, because automation in general is going to be cheaper, or is going to scale better than this manual testing. I think that's a problem across the industry, mobile apps, web apps, any types of apps. Anytime you're looking at the classes of vulnerabilities that you can only find via manual testing, again, automated testing was pretty successful in finding 58% of the vulnerabilities that we want. That said, it didn't find 100% or even 99% of the vulnerabilities. 42% of the vulnerabilities that we really care about were only found via manual testing. And so, again, when you look at, especially at systems that have access to high priority data, high value data, you need to be including, or you really need to seriously look at how much manual testing you're able to include in the portfolio of the assessment activities that you're doing, because in the absence of that, you're going to leave you're going to leave on the table, or you're going to leave undiscovered a pretty significant set of vulnerabilities. So if we look at automated versus manual versus and static versus dynamic, again, drilling into this. Automated static analysis found the most vulnerabilities that are considered low risk, which again speaks to the need to incorporate or to really understand when you're rolling out static analysis programs, how am I going to deal with the results that get kicked up? How am I going to shape the rule set so that the results I'm looking at first are the ones I'm most interested in? And how am I going to cull through these results so that you end up with a set of the stuff that you actually want? Also an interesting thing, we didn't find in our manual code review, we didn't find any critical vulnerabilities. But we did find a number of those, during the manual dynamic, essentially pen testing of these services and looking at the applications, identified some serious stuff as well. And again, we come back to it. If you look at the dual-edged sword of the static analysis was that it found a lot of low-risk stuff, but it also found 33 of the critical vulnerabilities that we really needed to identify. Now, so if we drill in and look at the automated versus manual, static versus dynamic, an interesting thing here is that our automated dynamic analysis didn't identify, did not identify any vulnerabilities in the data set. And I think there's two things that fed into that. I don't think that there are a lot of, we have some scripting stuff that we do and whatnot to fuzz local applications, local applications. That didn't turn up a lot of vulnerabilities that we, that made it into the study. And the automated analysis of web services, I think, is a lot less mature than automated analysis of web applications. I know that some of the scanner folks are working on this. It can be really dangerous, especially if you're looking at if you have functions exposed via the web service where they're changing something, they're making a transaction or they're moving money or deleting an account. It can be pretty dangerous to fuzz those where you walk yourself from index 1 up through whatever, if you have side effects associated with that. So I think that makes it challenging. Also, we see the explosion of the different protocols used to communicate back to systems, whether you're looking at SOAP web services, REST web services talking JSON, Hessian, other protocols to communicate this stuff. There's a lot of there's not a lot of standardization. There's a couple of big winners, but there's a lot of custom web services that are out there, and that makes it really hard to write dynamic assessment tools that cover all that stuff. I know we've looked at the NTO folks with their NT Spider is doing some really interesting stuff. With that, I'm sure that there's other vendors working on that as well. But as a tool class, that one I don't think is as mature, especially as we've seen with kind of a standard web application, dynamic testing tool or fuzzer. And so this, we see more of the same, where the manual dynamic analysis was effective in finding the vulnerabilities that we care the most about, and the static automated analysis was most effective in finding the things that we were most interested in. And so I thought that was interesting to see that, again, the effectiveness of the pen testing or dynamic manual analysis, as well as the effectiveness of the automated static analysis, the source code or binary review, those were the areas where we found those activities yielded the most high value or high importance vulnerabilities. And so if we do some analysis of this how data, again, a comprehensive mobile assessment program, you have to include manual testing. You're going to be missing, 40 whatever % of the vulnerabilities that are really the ones you need to care about. And so, again, how that gets spread out across your portfolio of mobile applications and their supporting services, can be challenging to make those kind of tough decisions. But it's important to understand that, looking across this data set, you have to include a non-trivial manual component in order to do this. As I said, the automated testing for mobile applications is not as mature for those testing web applications. And this is, I think, very much typified by it can be challenging to scale up the testing of these web services in an automated manner. Here's just a little teaser slide for everybody who wants to make decisions based on is iOS more secure or Android. I actually don't have a strong opinion on that yet. You look at the average number of vulnerabilities found per assessment. I think we're still a ways away from being able to make assertions about this. But I included it just because I like to stir up trouble. Another thing that we include with our assessments are what we call other observations, and these other observations are typically they reflect application weaknesses or coding flaws or behaviors that aren't best practice, but they don't reflect an immediate and exploitable vulnerability, right? And so this is additional stuff where we capture this as part of it. And again, if you changed code around or moved some things around, maybe you'd run into trouble. But they're not things that you would go and say, hey, this is a vulnerability you need to address right now. And the interesting thing was, we had roughly 1,948, we had 1,948 other observations, and that's roughly twice, if you just look at a raw vulnerability count, that was roughly twice as many actual vulnerabilities as we identified. And so that also speaks to the need to when you're running automated tools, automated static analysis, and also automated dynamic analysis, you need to be able to efficiently look at the data coming from those assessment activities and make a pretty quick decision to say, you know what, this class of result we're just not going to pay attention to at the current time. These specific rules we're just going to turn off because they have too common of a false positive rate. Because, and again, we're in a situation where, because we're doing assessments, if we kick up data, we've got to look at it. For in-house programs, you might not have, you have a better ability to set policies and say, well, we're just going to turn this stuff off. And that's going to be really important as you look to roll out automation. And so to really get the benefit of automation, again, automation was used to find a whole lot of very serious vulnerabilities. And so in the absence of automation, your program is going to be in trouble. But just the presence of automation is not enough. You've got to be smart about the way that you roll this stuff out. Looking at tweaking rule sets, looking at your evaluation criteria, that's something that also needs to be paid attention to. And again, these were found most commonly on the device, via corporate web services, and most of it's about code on the device. What does this tell us? Mobile application developers need some help building better code, right? People have been building web applications for quite some time. Mobile applications, especially modern, iOS and Android mobile applications, are a lot newer. And so developers, just from a sheer quality standpoint, often don't necessarily know the best practices of what they're supposed to do. And these are the types of coding mistakes that might not reflect an immediate vulnerability that exists in the system, but it's also best not to build up this type of technical debt, because these are the types of things that when you identify them, if the code gets configured differently, if it gets deployed with debug code on, you can run into situations where those observations that are, from a hygiene standpoint, you shouldn't have, become exploitable vulnerabilities. And again, the automated scanning tools, I think you've got to be very conscious of the way that you apply those. Something that we may see later on. You need to identify potential new platform vulnerabilities. The certain behaviors of iOS, certain behaviors of Android, and the behaviors of different security features change over time. So that's those are the types of things that with these other observations, it's important to keep in context. It's valuable to have this data out there. It's not something you're going to work on now, but it's something that you may need to be aware of, or could potentially provide back to the development teams so that they can start to include that in their process from a quality standpoint. So, in the conclusion, what do you need to test? Mobile apps are not standalone applications, or at least anything interesting, right? We don't, for whatever reason, for I think fairly obvious economic reasons and risk management reasons, we don't get called in to assess a lot of flashlight applications, right? That's not, those aren't the applications that most organizations are worried about. As an individual consumer worried about malware, maybe you're worried, but that's not really what we're looking here at security, not at privacy. But these mobile apps are not standalone applications. They're systems of applications. And you have code and data that are running and being stored on the device, right? We have code and data that's running and being stored on the web services, both in-house and third party. And these serious vulnerabilities can exist in any of the system, in any of the components of the system. And so when you're crafting a security program, don't sell yourself short. Don't cheat yourself. When we look at how do you craft a testing program, there are a number of benefits that mobile testing can provide, specifically in the form of automation. But manual review and testing is going to be required in order to find the most serious issues. That's potentially a big a big gap in coverage for folks that are relying solely on automation. And what we found is that it was a combination of static and dynamic testing is really required in order to get sufficient coverage. And again, the most effective techniques in finding the criticals and highs were the manual pen testing or manual dynamic analysis and automated static analysis. So the recommendations, you want to plan your strategy with coverage in mind so that you can understand and have a realistic view of, these are the activities in which I've engaged to test the security of this system. This is the level of coverage I'm expecting to receive from those. And that lets you make risk management decisions to say, you know what, I'd really love to manually pen test all my apps. I've only got the budget to do certain ones. All right. Again, it's those aren't great decisions to make, but they're real decisions that can be made. And our hope is that data like this is going to put you all in a situation where you can start to make those trade-off decisions. You want to evaluate the cost of automation. You don't just necessarily want to look at the cost is not just the licensing cost of getting the tool. Right? This automation needs to be deployed properly, and it's not that this is impossible to do, but it's something that you need to pay attention to. Or else you run the risk of having a lot of results that you need to sort through if you haven't properly tuned rule sets or configured different scans. And really, you want to look for opportunities to streamline. Some of the things that we've found in working with different organizations, mobile applications tend to have a pretty quick release cycle, or at least in certain organizations where they're pushing a lot of innovation through their mobile strategy. You can control the scope of your assessments, and that can help to stretch your budget, right? And so if you look at, well, hey, here's where the application was before. Here's the new version of the application. These are the new mobile features. These are the new web services that support those mobile features. This is the new third-party web services that we brought into that. You can potentially streamline and say, we're going to use automation across everything, but we're going to focus our manual efforts only on the diffs between the latest version of the application and what was before. That's obviously not as thorough or as, quote, good as doing a full test of the entire system, but that's a technique that can be applied in order to help stretch your budget. And you also need to look at, what's the cost associated with the reporting activities? Who are the consumers of this data in your organization? Is it the development teams? Is it your risk management group? What we found is you can look for ways to try and streamline that to stretch your budget further. Next steps for us, this is ongoing work for us. We're working to always incorporate more assessment data. We're also talking to the OAuth top 10 mobile risks. As I said earlier, they're doing a lot of work to make that form more data-driven. I'd also like to see a better analysis, or us do a better analysis of applications over time. So that you can see, do mobile applications get better, right, or do the teams get better over time? Also, we released a secure mobile application development reference that looked across a number of different areas when you're building applications. How do I protect data at rest? How do I protect data in transit? How do I guard against or detect rooting devices or jailbroken devices? The previous version of that is a couple years old, and it's still available online, but is a little bit dated, and we're working to update that later on. And so, keep an eye out on our social media and whatnot. We'll be releasing that again, and hopefully that'll be a valuable reference. Basically, to go down and allow your developers to understand, hey, Android developers, here's a couple of security critical things you need to pay attention to. Right? Read these descriptions, and you can follow these links for more information. Or similarly, hey, iOS developers, or for auditors that are concerned about data storage, you can look the other direction, saying, okay, well, I'm worried about secure data storage. Here's how Android does it. Here's how iOS does it, and so on and so forth. So keep an eye out for that. That's a resource that we're hoping to get pushed out here before too much longer. I think we've got some questions that came in along the way, and please keep the questions coming in, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right. I see that everyone expressed their consternation at how we had no slides, so that's sorry about that at the beginning. Okay, and so looking at a question, I think I addressed this, is the static testing code review. Again, when we talked about static testing there, unless we specifically talked about static, automated, or manual, static testing referred to any review of source code, either or the binary, either manual or automated. Excellent. We've got some questions or a question about taking a look at VIA Lab, VIA Forensics. We've looked at some of their stuff in the past. Talking about what automated tools were used for the dynamic testing. It was a combination of AppScan for most of the assessments in this pool. I believe it was AppScan, IBM Rational AppScan, and Burp Suite. And like I said, we've also looked at the stuff that the NTO guys are doing. Specifically around the testing of web services supporting mobile applications. And that's not meant to be an endorsement or whatever, or a condemnation of any vendors. That's just the tool set of the particular assessments that were rolled up into the data set that we have here. Excellent. Any other questions? Fantastic. Okay, good. Well, thank you all for coming out today. As I said, we're going to get the slides posted here, and as well as the video here posted shortly. And if you have any questions, again, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm just dan@denimgroup.com. On Twitter, you can find me at Daniel Cornell, and happy to answer any questions. And like I said, we'll get this stuff posted. There you go.
Thank you for joining us today. You'll be receiving an email soon that will alert you to the on-demand status of today's event so you can review any material you missed or share with a colleague. On October 29th, be sure to catch another of our principals, John Dixon, whose webinar for our RSA conference is entitled The Savvy Security Leader, Using Guerrilla Tactics to ID Security Program Resources. On behalf of our speaker, Dan Cornell, as well as the folks at Denim Group, we wish you a good day. Thank you for joining us and taking time to view this webinar. Bye-bye.